All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us here today. This is our first official NISC webinar, the first of hopefully many to come. Before we get started here, I would just want to give a shout out to David for actually making this webinar happen. It was David Clements that reached out to us on his new research paper he published, and he was wondering if we'd like to include it in our library of research summaries. We said, heck yeah, and then from there, this webinar was set up. So really happy that the NIST profile is expanding and word is getting out there. So if anyone today is in the audience working on invasive species or climate change and wants to learn more or set up something similar to this, please reach out to me. My email is on screen, chris@invasivescanada.ca. And yeah, I'd be happy to chat more. Okay, and now for the main event. I want to thank David Clements so much for being here and kicking things off for us. David is a weed ecologist and professor of biology at Trinity Western University in BC. His research on integrated weed management, invasive weed management, invasive riparian plants, Garry oak ecosystems, and climate change has yielded more than 100 scientific publications. He manages TWU's 3 field research sites and teaches ecological courses on campus, as well as field courses abroad on the BC coast and in Hawaii. In 2022, he published 2 edited books on invasive weeds and is one of the editors of the Biology of Invasive Plants series. He also edits a series on invasive species for Pacific Science that he helped found in 2007, and is also a founding board member of the Christian environmental stewardship group, A Rocha Canada. He is actively involved in several local environmental stewardship groups, such as the Fraser Valley Invasive Species Society and the Salmon River Enhancement Society, and writes a monthly column called The Green Beat for Langley Advance Times. So with that, I'm going to pass things on to you, David. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll stop sharing here.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. I'm going to share my slides here. Let's see. Is this working?
Brilliant. Yes, that looks perfect.
Great. Yeah. So, oh yeah, now we get the animation. We're talking about flooding here. So we're talking about implications of extreme flooding for knotweeds, and it's all based on a paper of the same name, Implications of Extreme Flooding Events for Dispersal of Rhinotria, Knotweeds in the Wake of Climate Change. And I want to give a big shout out to my co-authors here who did a lot of the work. Sarah Damien, Aidan Anderson, Jaylene Braithwaite, and Lauren McKenna. And I want to acknowledge that Trinity Western, where I work, is located on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Stalo people. And it's interesting when you do land acknowledgements, you're effectively acknowledging the rivers too, because the rivers are the lifeblood of the land. And for the Stalo, their river is the Stalo. It's the Fraser River. But I'm actually not there right now. I'm on sabbatical here in New Mexico on a different river. I'm studying invasive species on this river that you see here, which is the Rio Grande. And I found a really cool land acknowledgement that's used by the Las Cruces City Council, and that's where I am in Las Cruces. I respectfully acknowledge that the land on which I'm speaking from in the Mesilla Valley is the traditional and ancestral home of the Piero Manso Tiwa people. I recognize their long-standing, enduring relationship with this land, which they have cared for spiritually and ecologically since time immemorial. And that's the thing as we look at these rivers and the land they go through. We're looking at the results of long stewardship of the land. I also want to thank NISC and Invasives Canada, who Chris introduced you to there. Just thank you for the opportunity to share what we've been finding out in this paper that was just published this year. And I want to acknowledge our funders, including SSHRC, Trinity Western University. Look at my pointer going here. Yeah. NSERC, Weed Science Society of America, and also I really want to shout out Fraser Valley Invasive Species Society. They have been so helpful in both giving us advice, supporting our work, and just being a connection to the community in Chilliwack where we do our work. And this is also to thank all the students that have done the work, especially the four in the middle here. Those are the four co-authors, Lauren, Sarah, Aiden, and Jaylene there. And also you have Hannah and Bennett and many other students that have helped with this. And I also want to thank the Knotweed Lab, which we created as a result of the SHIRT grant. Now that is a social science grant. So we're used to dealing with science, but this got us out of our comfort zone and was really neat to be able to share what we were doing with knotweed with the public, as we continue to do in the Knotweed Lab. And this is us at an outreach event at the 2023 Chilliwack Run for Salmon. So you'll hear me talking a lot about salmon here because in British Columbia, salmon are the currency of often environmental quality. So this is what I'm going to talk about in the webinar today, and I'm going to use a metaphor here. It's 3 periods, and like many of you that are Canadians, I know there's probably a few Americans online here too. You watched the hockey game Sunday morning and also the previous women's game. It took place in 3 periods. So here's the 3 periods. The first period will be climate change and extreme flooding, talking about what happened in November 2021 in British Columbia and how that affected the river that we're working on, the Vedder-Chilliwack River. Then the second period gets into knotweed riding the flood, the nature of the beast, and then the numbers that we tracked, incredible increases in knotweed over that time, 5 times due to the flood. And then now it's up to 12 times the population before the flood. And then more bad news on tributaries as knotweed reservoirs. And finally, the third period, we're trying to score a goal here. If only Canada could have scored a goal in the third period. This is talking about knotweed as a problem for riparian health, the need for rapid responses, and how to develop a more resilient system. So, getting to the first period here, we have climate change and extreme flooding, and this is the effects of climate change that are most noticeable, these extreme events that happen. And this graph is produced by NOAA, and it shows all different kinds of extreme events that happen, including flooding, but also including other things related to flooding like winter storm count and so on. And you'll see this disturbing trend since 1980. It goes from 1980 to 2024. These extreme events are continuing, and you see this all the time. I mean, just last night I was watching the news of the extreme events in northwestern United States and getting into the Maritimes where Chris is, extreme storms. Another alarming thing about this figure is that I tried to update it because you see it only goes to 2024. And the website for NOAA says that due to changing priorities and lack of resources, we are no longer tracking this data. And so you know what that's about, and it's just a difficult time to study climate in the United States and other places. So it's just a sign of a problem here. We're not paying attention to the climate enough. But I was sure paying attention. November 2021, this is my Monday morning. And of course, all Monday mornings have their problems, but this Monday morning was particularly problematic. I thought to myself, well, it seemed like it rained a lot this weekend. Like, this seemed like more rain than usual. And then when I got to work, the road that I normally drive into my class was completely covered with water, so I had to go way around the other side. And in fact, as I drove in over the bridge, I saw a car in the water on Glover Road. And it turned out the Trinity Western administration had missed the boat on this. Classes were on. I walked into my class, there's hardly anyone there, and they canceled classes later. But basically, the whole province was caught flat-footed by this sudden flooding. And the flooding was caused by atmospheric rivers, two huge atmospheric rivers that hit the Pacific Northwest in rapid succession. So this was November 2021. And atmospheric rivers is an interesting term. They actually happen relatively commonly in British Columbia because it's just water from tropical areas going to the poles. But some of the ones that are large are very problematic. They can hold as much water vapor as 25 Mississippi rivers. And so climate change makes these large atmospheric rivers more common. So what we saw that November was horrendous. This is the Fraser Valley. Normally what you'd be seeing here is a bunch of farms and it's all covered in water. There was huge damage to the farms. Many livestock were lost and huge infrastructure costs as well. Another view of the valley here, what you're seeing here is the Trans-Canada Highway. And I can remember the Canadian National News was broadcasting with this in the background, showing how our Trans-Canada Highway had been disrupted. And indeed, there was a lot of damage from what they call a 100-year flood. Now, I put this in quotations because 100-year floods are going to become more common with climate change. And there's a huge cost to this. But I'm always wondering when I see this news is it spreading invasive plants as part of the problem? The costs, in fact, were tremendous. It was the costliest natural disaster ever in British Columbia history. Huge insurance costs, actual cost in billions, and someone did a calculation that was 17 billion for the year, which also included the heat dome, another climate change event in the summer. And then the cost just kept increasing from there. They had to fix up the Barrowtown pump station shown here, where Premier Eby is making an announcement of this funding to fix it up. It just barely held on during the flood, thanks to some brave volunteers that went in and tried to make sure it didn't fail. And then a lot more money spent in the Abbotsford area and other parts of the province. And on the river itself, they put in 13 million to do gravel extraction, a huge project for the river, not for invasive species per se. So this is the graphic of the rainfall that was experienced that created my Monday morning. And what it did for the river was made a discharge of over 700 cubic meters per second, 10 times the mean discharge. It's already a fast-moving, large river, but it went crazy. And these are pictures I took in the aftermath with all this debris that had been carried downstream, having been, basically the land gets scoured by the flood. And people did scientists did a study of the flood in terms of climate change, and the fingerprints of climate change are on this flood because as they concluded from their careful study, this is an amazing paper to read. The probability of events, at least this large, has been increased by a best estimate of 45% by human-induced climate change. So I'm going to read from this psalm, which is what I call the ecology psalm. I got that term from my colleague at Trinity, Karen Steensma. It really promotes the wildness of rivers and the strength that rivers have in the world. Says, he set the earth on its foundations, it can never be moved. You covered it with the watery depths as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, but at your rebuke the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. And I think of the mighty Vedder-Chilliwack, flowing down the valley. They flowed over the mountains, they went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. You set a boundary they cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. This line about the boundary, I think, need to think carefully about this. It doesn't mean rivers are supposed to stay within their banks all the time. Rivers naturally move and change courses depending on what's going on. And they aren't meant to be channeled, as unfortunately many people try and keep them in their boundaries. But what I think we should think about here is the two boundaries that have been crossed thanks to us. Climate change makes these events more extreme, and invasive species have crossed a boundary. Knotweed is native to Eastern Asia and Japan, where it does fine in its environment, doesn't cause problems. Here, it causes problems, as we'll see. And here's the river exceeding its boundaries in a huge way during that flooding. You can just see how crazy it was. These pictures weren't taken by me, but some brave person went and did a video of what was going on. But here you see the statistics tracking the manual maximum daily discharge over the years of our study. The height was these 2 days in November 2021 when it got up to 719 cubic meters per second. Huge flow. And what it did to the river was visible from space, basically. If you watch this graphic here, you'll see in 2021, the river course is shown. In 2022, it changed course considerably and created some islands, and as well as scraping the vegetation off parts of the area, which really opens the field for things like knotweed that are going to go in and colonize. And in fact, my students referred to one of these islands as Knotweed Island because they found a lot of knotweed on it when they were doing the survey. So this is a beautiful river in the Chilliwack area, the Vedder-Chilliwack River. It flows 80 kilometers northwest from Washington to the Fraser River, the Blaauw River. It's one of the most popular salmon fishing rivers in BC. Also popular for walking, cycling, whitewater rafting, you name it. We're always amazed when we see people enjoying the river as we're doing our research. So we wanted to reach out to the public and say there's a problem with the river, and it's called knotweed. So we managed to, through the funding we had it on buses that drove in the Chilliwack area. Knotweed is taking over the Chilliwack River. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration there, but it's to get the attention of the public of this issue so that the people that are fishing the river realize that the river has to be taken care of and things like invasive species need to be dealt with. So now we get to the second period of the hockey game where knotweed rides the flood. So this photo was taken during our surveying in the 2022 summer season, so following the flood of November 2021. And you can see how the knotweed is growing out of the debris that was brought down with the flooding. And as we contemplated doing this survey, we realized that other people have seen similar things in other parts of the world. Like in Vermont, there was a tropical storm Irene in 2011, and the floodwaters were tremendous, so they alone moved the knotweed. But what Brian Colleran found was that the spread was also encouraged by what the crews did afterwards to try and clean up the debris. They moved the knotweed further. So pointed out, these events really have an effect on knotweed. And in Quebec, Claude Lavoie has studied knotweed spread in a couple of watersheds, the Chaudière and Etchemin rivers. And similarly, you can see in these maps, like knotweed has spread through the whole river, and they've mapped out how seasonal flooding moves the knotweed around and moves these small shoots, we'll talk more about later. And they did an experiment with the Etchemin where they removed some of the small shoots and found that it was economical if it was a relatively small infestation, but if it got too big, it was not economical because that's a lot of labor to remove the knotweed. But on the other hand, what are you going to do? So we did this survey in 2022, and this shows Lauren and Jaylene measuring the knotweed. So we counted all the knotweed, the new patches, and measured them, and it was quite an exercise. And I remember going around, and they already had the experience, and suddenly they saw knotweed everywhere where I couldn't even see it, but they were very good at doing this. We also looked at the tributaries for the first time. The river had been surveyed in 2019, but the tributaries had not been surveyed. So we also surveyed knotweed in the tributaries. So what is this knotweed anyway? What's the nature of knotweed? Well, you can see by this photo of some of my research students, it's a big plant and it grows large, forms these patches that are monocultures, something incredible. It has very fast growth rates. It dies off over the winter, but in the summer it quickly grows up as shown here, and it really likes water. It does best to grow and reproduce near water, has extensive underground rhizome networks, and can disperse by its rhizomes and its seeds. And another thing that knotweed has to its advantage is because it does so well next to rivers, that's the very place where herbicide use is restricted in most jurisdictions. And so it can thrive in these riverside areas unabated. Sometimes they allow particular herbicide applications like injection with herbicide, but you can imagine that's a very labor-intensive way of dealing with it. And I love this truth that Kathy Ma-Green has expressed on many occasions. Here she knotweed walk, talking to some members of the public about it, saying you need to understand that much of this plant exists underground. And you can see that the Fraser Invasive Species Society has knotweed as their logo for natural reasons, because that's where most of their budget goes to. But what she means by this is that, you know, the above ground portion of knotweed is substantial, but it's even more substantial underground, especially once the patches have developed. And what this means is it's not easy to control. You think, oh, I'll just go dig it up, but you won't get all the roots. Or maybe I'll cut it, but it'll grow back. Or even when you spray it, it comes back. So some of the herbicides can penetrate down into the rhizomes, but it doesn't always work. So think about that being mostly underground. My students have thought about that. And often in the literature they say, well, the rhizomes are so long, but they wanted to find out from themselves. So I didn't even tell them to do this, but one day they dug up a rhizome just to see how big they are. So hopefully this graphic photo allows you to see how big they are underground, just really extensive. So another tool they have at their disposal is their evolutionary biology. And Vanessa Jones did undergrad work with me on knotweed. She's now PhD working with Jennifer Grens at UBC, also still working on knotweed. We did this paper to look at the genetic tools that different invasive plants have, which could be an enhanced genetic variation, or even could be reduced genetic variation where you have a clonal plant, like knotweed can be often very clonal, and that comes to its advantage as well. So it's very interesting. We plotted out all these different ways that genetic advantage happens and gives the plant an evolutionary advantage. And many plants have one or two of these six genetic advantages. And then when we looked at knotweed, Vanessa and I weren't surprised. Knotweed uses all six of these genetic tools to its advantage. So as we'll see, it can increase its genetic variation through seed production, but it also does very well with reduced genetic variation when it forms these huge clones. So like the here. And originally when knotweed came into North America, we didn't worry about seed production because Japanese knotweed was male sterile. So it didn't produce much pollen, so all the plants were females, so it did not spread, it couldn't produce seeds. But then giant knotweed came along, and giant knotweed crossed with Japanese knotweed, and what you got out of that cross was a lot of pollen, because giant knotweed has a lot of pollen, so it's not male sterile. So when you put the two together, what you get is Bohemian knotweed. So it's kind of a third species, even though it's a hybrid. And that hybrid can continue to breed with its parents. And as we say here, the Japanese knotweed is a lot more invasive. And so Bohemian is quite a difficult plant to deal with because it produces seeds and it's quite invasive. And the genetics are graphically shown in this paper by John Gaskin and his colleagues, where the Japanese knotweed is all here. It's all one single genotype. But then when you put it together with giant knotweed, you get this, what's known as a hybrid swarm with many different types of Bohemian knotweed. So this genetic diversity has the potential to unleash many more versions on the knotweed theme. You could call it a Bohemian Rhapsody. So what this Bohemian Rhapsody does with seed production, you can get an optimal variety of knotweed that's going to produce really good seed production of seeds that are adapted to floating in the water. So once again, knotweed, its relationship with water has the advantage here. And we studied what happens to seeds when they fall in the water. And the first step is they germinate. Once they sink and float again, germinate. Then they form cotyledons over here. Then they exhibit true leaves. And then finally, if they're still in the water, after a long time, they die. That's just too long in the water. But they are very adapted to being in the water. You can see here, mortality doesn't occur till at least 40 days after it's been in the water. So that's biblical. Like 40 days. And so there's a good chance that these seedlings could get established. However, our research and research around the world has found that the best way for knotweed to spread is through rhizome fragments. So what you see here is a young knotweed plant growing from a rhizome fragment. This is the year that we did our survey, and you can see that this is what floated down the stream and formed this new plant. It's got lots of energy in the rhizome that's going to feed the developing plant, which makes it a very effective way to spread. And of course, it doesn't look like much, just this little plant, but someday, if it's allowed to continue, it will grow into a huge clonal patch like this. So getting to the results here, we counted 1,690 knotweed patches along the Vedder-Chilliwack River in 2022 after the flood of November. And when you compare that to the previous survey in 2019, that's a 5 times population increase. The old records are in orange here, and the new patches we counted are in green. So you can see it's a very huge increase. I don't know how many hockey goals that would give you, but it's a lot of goals on the side of knotweed there. Knotweed did very well following the flood. And we could see that the flood was responsible for these knotweed patches developing because a lot of them developed within the debris that was carried down by the flood event. And we wanted to see what happened over time. So every year we went back to see the state of the populations in the river. So we resurveyed in 2023 and found that patches were kind of maintaining about the same population, actually 75%. But then by 2024, we started seeing more increases. And then the momentum really built up to this past summer in 2025, where it was like double the previous year. So this is the story comparing 2025 to 2022. And this is not a good story because you can see the orange are the new patches in 2025. So this population momentum that began with the flooding in 2022 is really increasing in that year. So this table summarizes all of the data we've collected since 2022. And you'll see at the far end of the table here, it's 5 times as much in that first year, but now 12 times as much. And when we saw the 12 times figure, Sarah, Damien, and I were like, where did that come from? And looking at the records, the rainfall records, there was a huge flood in October 2024. Not the kind of flood we saw in November 2021, but a big flood that was probably responsible for this huge increase in the last year. It didn't exceed the banks, but still spread the knotweed. Of course, the knotweed's already happy there because it's doing well. So now for some bad news, more bad news in this second period. The tributaries. As I said, they hadn't been surveyed before, but when we went up the tributaries, it was like, ooh, there's some big knotweed plants here. You can see this one's flowering here, and you can see how the knotweed is dwarfing Aidan and Lauren here as they survey the tributary. And we looked at the size of the patches by size class. So the largest size class is 5, and that is for over 20 stems and over 2 meters in height. And the smallest would be, just a single small stem. And you can see a predominance of these large patches in the tributaries. And when you compare that to the main channel, it's the opposite. In the main channel, most of the patches are these small ones that have been recently dispersed, whereas you have just a few larger ones, and you have the opposite pattern in the tributaries. So that means, the tributaries are a reservoir for knotweed spreading down the river. So presumably when flooding happens, some of the knotweed from the tributaries comes to the main river. So now we get to the third period. What are we going to do? We really need to score a goal. That's the frustrating thing about the hockey game. If you saw it on Sunday, it's like they did everything they could, but they couldn't seem to score a goal in that third period and went into overtime. So what you see in this picture of the Chilliwack Vedder River is there's a lot of plants here that are cottonwood, black cottonwood, and that is a native plant that behaves much like knotweed. It has a big affinity with the river, does well with a lot of water. It moves with flooding. It produces a lot of seeds that, under the right conditions, can do well. So if you're going to build a more climate resilient riparian zone, you need to pay attention to these native species and what they do for the ecosystem. And so you have to ask the question, why is cottonwood or some other native species better than knotweed? What does it matter if you have knotweed here versus a nice patch of cottonwood, say? And we've talked about this with the public. This is one of our knotweed walks that is organized by Kathy here. We talked to them about the values that they espouse there, and the nature values the salmon and the creatures that depend on the salmon. I got this delightful picture of an American dipper last December that was feeding on the eggs that come from the salmon. So what difference does it make if it's cottonwood versus knotweed? That's the big question. And part of the difference is in little things that we don't usually think about or that annoy us, like, say, mosquitoes, the arthropods. But if you look on the faces of these 3 students, I'm not going to show you their data, we're still working with that, but these 3 students have delighted in studying the arthropod diversity, comparing knotweed to cottonwood. And Jaylene started it off looking at ground arthropods, then Megumi looked at aerial arthropods by setting up sticky traps, and then finally Ginny has been working with the arthropods that actually climb on the plants, trying to figure out how the diversity compares, because biodiversity is what makes a river healthy. Also, biodiversity increases the river's ability to prevent erosion and be more resilient. And Brian Colleran has also worked with colleagues in Chile, and they did this paper. So knotweed is a problem in Chile as well. It's a big problem in many parts of Europe, so it's not just North America. And what they say in this paper is if you have these stands of knotweed established, the structure of the roots that normally hold the soil is compromised, leading to underbank erosion. And we know from what we saw there that erosion leads to spread of knotweed and increasing knotweed. So it's a vicious circle where the more the knotweed affects the environment by causing more erosion, the more you get more knotweed, and it's just not a good situation. And we've also looked at this in the Vedder-Chilliwack River. Jaden here studied it by digging these pits down a meter or so to look at the profile of the roots underground. So the top figure here is for cottonwood, and you can see the roots extend well below the surface, whereas with knotweed, most of them are at the surface. So knotweed is, has a large presence under the surface, but it's not as good at holding the soil because it doesn't extend deep enough. Also, the tensile strength, Jaden measured that and found that the cottonwood roots would be much slower to break than the knotweed roots. And that makes sense because knotweed wants to break apart. It wants to break so it can send the pieces downstream, form new knotweed plants. So it's not very good at holding the river. So as we consider all these invasions, we're looking at a slow motion invasion. Right after the flood, like in November 2021, it was an emergency. There was bridges that were taken out. There was widespread damage that had to be dealt with. So that was the immediate priority. However, there's also an invasion happening quietly. Invasive species are often left to their own devices and continue to spread long after the initial response. And so what I'm saying here is we need to pay more attention to this. And certainly the river itself, there was attention paid to that, where they spent $13 million on actually the largest gravel extraction ever. And that was a bit alarming to us because we thought maybe it might spread knotweed, but they were careful about that, fortunately. And so I asked Becky Brown, who's the invasive plant specialist, what did the government do to do this? And fortunately, to deal with the flooding and invasive species. And fortunately, the government did pay attention because we live in a jurisdiction, British Columbia, where invasive species are prioritized. So they did do a number of things. They did a risk analysis, they targeted surveys to see what plants were spreading due to the flood, and they also took measures to ensure that the aggregate removal did not cause undue spread, as we saw. So they did do some things kind of quietly. Of course, Premier Eby's not going to announce, oh, we're also looking after invasive species, because it's not a big deal to the public at this point. But Becky did say that some new plant invasions did occur, and so that invasive plant management efforts returned to a zero starting point post-flood. Obviously, we need more resources to deal with invasive species. So how are we going to get that goal, or several goals we need in the third period? We need to build a more climate resilient riparian zone. When the area is scoured by flooding, as you can see here, knotweed is going to be the first to move in, so maybe we should plant some native species like cottonwood to make it more resilient. Also, the whole river is not really that resilient in general, because if you look at the plant species growing there, it's not just knotweed, it's blackberry, it's clematis, it's butterfly bush. There's a lot of invasive species that don't serve the same ecosystem services. So there's a lot to do to create a more climate resilient riparian zone. And I think it's urgent, not just because I think it'd be nice, but because the flooding continues. In fact, December 2025, there was the worst flood that's happened since November 2021. And I watched this like I was watching an exciting hockey game with nervousness because the flooding was tremendous. It was close to what it was in November 2021. A lot of debris was spread downstream. This is just my photos from later, but I also saw a lot of photos of the river, the raging river amidst this flood, and a lot of damage was done in British Columbia again in December 2025. So something to worry about. So that's the end of the third period, and hopefully there's time for questions now. I want to point out my email address if you have other questions you think about later. And also, the paper that we made is not open access, but if you email me, I can send you a copy of the paper. I'd be glad to do that. So my email address is clements@tw.ca. So thank you very much.